Welcome to another deep dive. Today we're cracking open Charles Duhigg's The Power of Habit.
Oh, interesting.
It's all about those hidden forces that shape our lives. Like, have you ever grabbed a cookie in the afternoon without even thinking about it?
You mean like a mindless snack? Yeah, definitely guilty of that.
Right. Or wondered how some people manage to just completely transform their lives?
I've always wondered about that. What's the secret?
Well, that's what we're going to find out. We'll be diving into the science behind habits, how to break bad ones, and even how companies use this stuff to predict what we want before we even know it ourselves.
Sounds a little creepy, but also fascinating.
Yeah, it's going to get pretty deep. And to help us navigate all of this, we have a real expert with us. They're amazing at connecting the dots.
Glad to be here. Ready to dive in?
So Duhigg, he starts off with this really compelling story about this woman named Lisa who quit smoking.
Oh, wow.
It was during a trip to Cairo, and it wasn't just a random decision, you know? She was going through a lot. Her husband had left her, and she had some pretty unhealthy coping mechanisms.
Sounds like she was at a real turning point.
Yeah, it was a crisis for sure. But on that trip, something shifted. She realized to get her life back, she needed to quit.
So it wasn't just like a New Year's resolution kind of thing.
Nope, it was much deeper than that. And it wasn't just willpower that helped her succeed. Over the next few months, Lisa replaced smoking with jogging.
Interesting.
And that had this ripple effect on everything else, her diet, her work, even her sleep and finances.
Wow, a total life overhaul.
Totally. And the crazy part? Scientists looked at her brain scans and they saw those old neurological patterns from smoking. They were literally being overwritten by new ones from jogging.
So our brains are physically changing as we form new habits.
Exactly. It's pretty mind-blowing. It's like habits have this physical presence in our brains.
Makes you think about the potential, both good and bad.
For sure. Speaking of which, Duhigg then brings up this really interesting case of Eugene, a patient with amnesia.
Amnesia, so he couldn't remember things.
Right. He couldn't form new memories, but here's the thing. He could still develop new habits.
Wait, how is that possible? If he couldn't remember, how could he learn new habits?
Well, that's what makes it so fascinating. It shows that habits aren't totally dependent on our conscious memory. There's something else going on in the brain.
So like a separate system for habits.
Yeah, exactly. Duhigg calls it the habit loop.
Okay, the habit loop. I'm intrigued.
Think of it as a three-part process. There's the cue, which is like a trigger that sets things in motion.
Okay, the cue. What then?
Then comes the routine, the actual action you perform, and finally there's the reward, which reinforces the whole loop.
The reward makes you want to do it again. Makes sense.
And Duhigg uses that classic experiment with rats in a maze to illustrate this. You know that one.
I think I've heard of it.
So there's this rat, and it hears a click. That's the cue. Then it navigates the maze. That's the routine. And at the end, it finds a piece of chocolate.
The reward.
Bingo. And the researchers noticed that over time, the rat's brain activity changed. It stopped actively thinking about the maze and just zoomed through it automatically.
So the habit loop kicked in.
Exactly. The rat's brain basically created this shortcut, letting it do the routine without really thinking about it.
It's like we're all running on these subconscious programs sometimes.
Totally. And a lot of that automation is thanks to a part of our brain called the basal ganglia.
The basal ganglia. Is that like habit central?
You got it. It's
Yeah.
essential for forming habits, both good and bad. And here's the catch. It doesn't judge. It just learns and reinforces patterns based on the cues and rewards it gets.
So if we have bad habits, they're kind of hardwired in there.
Pretty much. That's why understanding the habit loop is so important.
So we can reprogram those bad habits.
Yeah, if we can figure out the cue and the reward, we can start changing the routine.
Okay, I'm starting to see how this works.
Now remember, Eugene, our friend with amnesia, every morning he'd go for a walk, even though he couldn't remember where his house was.
So how did he find his way back?
It's wild, right? The cues along his walk, like certain trees or mailboxes, they were consistent enough to trigger his go-home routine.
Even though he didn't consciously recognize them.
Exactly. It's like having an internal GPS that guides us without us even knowing it. But here's the thing. These patterns aren't always helpful. Eugene also had this weird habit of eating multiple breakfasts.
Even if she wasn't hungry.
Yep, even if he wasn't hungry.
So the wrong cue would trigger the wrong routine.
Right, like if the morning light or his radio turned on, his brain would just go into breakfast mode regardless.
It's like our brains are on autopilot sometimes.
Seriously, it makes you realize how much of our lives is running on these subconscious programs. But let's shift gears for a sec and talk about how companies use this stuff.
Oh, this is where it gets a little scary, right?
It can be. Duhigg has this great example with Febreze.
Febreze, the air freshener.
Yeah, and get this, it was a total flop when it first came out.
Really? Why?
Yeah.
Who doesn't want a fresh-smelling house?
It turns out people didn't see bad smells as a problem they needed to fix.
I guess nobody wants to admit their house stinks.
Exactly. So they redesigned the bottle, changed the marketing, and started emphasizing this burst of freshness after cleaning.
So they made it part of the cleaning routine, like a reward.
Right. And it worked. People even started spraying diluted perfume when they ran out of Febreze.
They were hooked on that feeling of freshness.
It's incredible how powerful those cues and rewards can be.
Speaking of which, Duhigg tells this story about Claude Hopkins, the guy behind Pepsodent toothpaste. Back then, toothbrushing wasn't exactly popular.
Yeah, I can imagine.
He realized to make it a habit, he needed a cue and a reward. He found his cue in tooth film, that gritty feeling on your teeth.
Ah, so something people could relate to, a physical sensation.
Exactly. And the reward, that tingly feeling Pepsodent gave you. It wasn't even about clean teeth, it was about the sensation.
We think we're making rational choices, but sometimes it's all about those cravings.
Totally. Understanding the habit loop can be really powerful, both for us and for companies. But habits don't just affect us as individuals. They can shape entire organizations. Duhigg brings up Tony Dungy, the NFL coach.
Okay, Tony Dungy, what did he do?
He transformed the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. They were one of the worst teams.
Wow, a real underdog story. What was his secret? Some crazy playbook.
He knew football was about instinct, not just thinking.
The game's too fast to overthink everything.
Exactly. So instead of complex plays, he built simple habits, training them to react to cues on the field.
So like programming their basal ganglia for peak performance?
Exactly. It worked. They went from losers to contenders.
Wow, the power of habit.
It applies to our lives, too. Think about breaking down big goals into smaller habitual steps.
Yeah, building momentum through those small wins.
Exactly. Now let's switch gears again. Duhigg also talks about Alcoholics Anonymous.
Interesting. How does that fit in?
AA uses the habit loop to fight addiction. They don't try to erase the craving. They acknowledge the cue, the desire to drink.
And the reward, the feeling alcohol gives.
Right, but they replace the routine with healthy ones.
Like reaching out to a sponsor instead of reaching for a bottle.
Exactly. Same cue and reward, but a different routine. Plus, the community support helps build new habits.
It's amazing how the habit loop applies to so many things.
It is. And this idea of changing routines leads to something really important. Belief.
Belief. Like believing in yourself.
Exactly. Duhigg says people who believe they can change are way more likely to succeed, whether it's quitting drinking or eating healthier.
That makes sense. You gotta believe to achieve.
Totally. But there's another piece, keystone habits.
Keystone habits, what are those?
They're special habits that create a ripple effect, changing other parts of your life.
Okay, give me an example.
Duhigg talks about Paul O'Neill, a CEO who made worker safety the priority.
Worker safety, how did that change everything?
It wasn't just about accidents. It changed communication, leadership, processes, everything.
So one small change led to a whole company transformation.
It was a catalyst. It makes you wonder, what could be our keystone habit?
What one change could spark positive changes in other areas? That's something to think about.
Definitely. But changing habits isn't easy. It takes willpower.
And Duhigg talks about willpower as this limited resource.
Like a muscle that gets tired.
I've definitely felt that.
He mentions the famous marshmallow test. Kids choose between one marshmallow now or two later.
Oh yeah, the ones who waited did better in life, right?
Exactly. It shows how willpower early on predicts success later.
But it's hard to resist that marshmallow.
To illustrate willpower depletion further, there's the cookie versus radish experiment.
Let me guess. One group got cookies, the other radishes.
You got it. The radish eaters were more likely to give up on a challenging task later.
Willpower fatigue. It's why we make bad choices when we're tired.
Exactly. But there are ways to manage it. Companies like Starbucks train employees to handle tough customers.
So instead of reacting emotionally, they have these pre-programmed responses.
Exactly. Helps them stay calm even when someone's yelling.
We all need that skill sometimes. Okay, so we've covered individuals, organizations, willpower. Now let's get to the spooky part, big data and predictions.
This is where it gets really interesting.
Duhigg tells this story about Andrew Pohl, a guy at Target who figured out how to predict pregnancies.
Wait, predict pregnancies? How?
They analyzed purchase data looking for patterns that suggest someone's expecting.
Like buying prenatal vitamins.
Exactly. They could then send baby product coupons even before the woman told anyone.
That's both amazing and a little creepy.
Definitely raises some ethical questions.
Big time. Where's the line between being helpful and being intrusive?
Right. No one wants to feel like they're being watched. But this all makes you think about free will, too.
If companies can predict our choices, are we really in control?
It's a question philosophers have debated for ages.
It's almost like we're following a script written by our data.
It's a question worth pondering. Are we just puppets of our habits in these algorithms?
Or do we still have the power to choose our own path? Lots to think about.
I think we need to explore this further. We were just talking about how companies are using data to predict our habits, and it got me thinking about all the marketing stuff we're bombarded with. Do you ever feel like maybe you're being manipulated by all of it?
Yeah, it's a valid concern. It's like, are we really making choices or just following a script, right?
Yeah.
Duhigg actually brings up a story about how Target's pregnancy predictions backfired. Remember, they were able to figure out if a customer was pregnant.
Yeah, based on what they were buying?
Exactly. Well, they sent these baby coupons to a teenage girl, and her dad totally freaked out, thinking they were encouraging teen pregnancy. But it turned out she was pregnant, but hadn't told anyone yet.
Oh, that's got to be awkward. So how did Target deal with that?
They had to get a lot more subtle. Instead of sending obviously targeted coupons, they mixed them in with other random stuff, so it wasn't so in your face.
So they were still kind of nudging people in a certain direction, just less obviously.
Right, it's a delicate balance. But this whole prediction thing brings us back to that question about free will. If companies can predict our choices so accurately, are we really in control?
It's a question that goes way beyond marketing, too. Think about health insurance. What if they can predict who's going to get sick?
Or criminal justice, predicting who's going to commit a crime?
Right. It's kind of a scary thought. It's do these predictions become self-fulfilling prophecies?
It's something we have to be really careful about, you know?
Yeah.
We need to make sure we're using this technology ethically and responsibly.
It makes you really think about all those little choices we make. What I eat, what I buy, what I watch. Am I really in control or just following some pre-programmed path?
It's a good question to ask ourselves. But even if our choices are influenced by outside factors, just being aware of those influences can help us make more conscious decisions.
Okay, so awareness is key. But what about those times when we know what we should be doing, but just can't seem to do it? We talked about willpower being like a muscle and it gets tired, but can we actually train it to be stronger?
Duhigg talks about willpower depletion and how it affects not just our ability to resist temptation, but also things like decision-making and even physical stamina.
I can definitely relate to that. By the end of the day, my willpower is gone.
Right. When we're mentally exhausted, our willpower reserves are lower, so we're more likely to give in to those bad habits.
So it's like our brain is saying, just give me the easy option. I can't fight anymore.
Exactly. But the good news is that willpower is like a muscle that we can train. The more we use it, even in small ways, the stronger it gets.
So it's not about being superhuman and resisting everything all the time.
No, it's more about making small, conscious choices throughout the day that require willpower and gradually increasing those challenges over time.
So it's more about working with our willpower rather than against it.
Exactly. And there are other strategies too, like planning ahead to avoid those temptation triggers and making sure we're getting enough sleep.
So if you know you're going to be facing a tough decision later, try to make things easier on yourself.
Right. Be proactive. And this ties back into the habit loop. If we know what cues trigger our bad habits, we can start changing those routines without relying so much on willpower.
So it's not about trying to change everything at once. It's about those small tweaks that add up over time.
Exactly. Even small changes can have a big impact.
Okay, that makes me feel a little better. I can handle tweaking a few routines. But what about when we're not just trying to change our own habits? What about those bigger changes, like social movements? We talked a bit about how habits are involved there.
Yeah, we talked about the bus boycott. But Duhigg really gets into how habits fuel the entire civil rights movement. It wasn't just the big speeches and leaders. It was about the everyday habits of community, friendship, and shared purpose.
So those individual actions, multiplied by thousands of people, created something much bigger.
Exactly. People were risking their lives, not just for abstract ideas, but because their friends were doing, their neighbors, their church. It became a habit of courage and solidarity.
That's really powerful. It shows how small actions can contribute to huge change.
And Duhigg talks about the importance of both strong ties, like close friends, and weak ties, like acquaintances or people we follow online.
Oh.
Those strong ties provide the initial motivation, but the weak ties help spread the message further.
So if you want to start a movement, start by talking to your friends and sharing your ideas.
Right, and as those conversations spread, they can connect with others and build momentum. It's like a ripple effect.
This makes me think about how social habits shape our lives in less dramatic ways, too, like within our families or at work.
Absolutely. Duhigg even talks about how subtle cues can affect our memories. There's this study where researchers found that the way someone asks a question, like their tone of voice, can actually influence how a witness remembers an event.
So you're saying that even if someone's trying to be truthful, the way they're asked a question can make them misremember details.
It's like our brains are wired to pick up on those subtle cues of friendship and trust. And sometimes those cues can override our actual memories.
Wow, that's incredible. It's like all these subconscious things are affecting us all the time.
It highlights how important it is to be aware of those subtle influences.
Okay, so we've talked about how habits can be predicted, manipulated, and how they play a role in movements. But it all comes down to this. How do we change the habits that aren't working for us? We talked about the habit loop and willpower, but is there anything else we can do?
Duhigg really emphasizes the importance of belief. Believing that you can change makes a huge difference.
So it's like, if you believe you're capable of changing, you're more likely to put in the effort.
Exactly. And it's not just about positive thinking. It's about having that sense of agency, that belief that you have the power to shape your own life.
But what about those times when you feel totally stuck and willpower just isn't enough? Like you've tried to change a habit a million times and you just keep falling back into the same pattern?
This is where those keystone habits come back in. Remember how we talked about how they have a ripple effect?
Yeah, like Paul O'Neill focusing on worker safety and how it changed the whole company culture.
Duhigg says keystone habits often work by creating structures that make it easier to adopt other good habits. Like, he talks about a study where people were asked to keep a food journal.
Just write down what they ate, no crazy diets or anything.
Exactly. And just that simple act of tracking their food led to all sorts of positive changes.
So they started eating less just because they were writing it down?
It wasn't really about consciously restricting their food. It was about becoming more mindful. By writing down what they ate, they started noticing patterns.
They became aware of their habits.
Exactly. And that awareness made it easier to make healthier choices.
So it wasn't about willpower. It was about creating a structure, the food journal, that helped them make better decisions.
It's a key point from the book. Habit change isn't just about individual effort. It's also about creating the right environment to support those changes.
So it's about setting yourself up for success.
Exactly. And this applies to all kinds of habits. Like, if you want to be more productive, create a workspace that minimizes distractions.
It's about those small changes that nudge you in the right direction.
Right. You want to make the good choice the easy choice.
This is giving me so many ideas. But before we move on, I want to ask you something. We've talked so much about the power of habits, but do you ever worry that we're overlooking other things that might be important? Like, what about talent or creativity or even just plain luck?
It's a really important point. Habits are just one piece of the puzzle. We can't discount the role of our natural abilities or the circumstances we're born into, or even just random chance events.
So it's about finding a balance, right? Recognizing the power of habits, but also acknowledging that life is complex.
Absolutely. Habits are a powerful tool, but they're not the only tool.
Okay, that's a good reminder. This has been such a fascinating conversation. What insights have really resonated with you?
For me, it's the idea that even small changes in our habits can have a ripple effect, not just on our own lives, but on the lives of others. It's pretty amazing to think about how those small actions can lead to big changes in the world.
I love that. Well, on that note, I think we're ready to wrap up this part of our deep dive. We've learned so much about how habits work, how they can be changed, and how they shape our lives.
We've covered a lot of ground, but there's still more to explore in Duhigg's book.
Right. In the next part, we'll be diving into those final chapters where he tackles some really big questions about habit, free will, and responsibility.
We'll be revisiting the story of Brian Thomas, who killed his wife while sleepwalking, and contrasting that with Angie Bachman's experience with gambling.
It's going to be a really thought-provoking conversation about the line between our conscious choices and those powerful, often unconscious forces of habit. But until then, we encourage you to keep thinking about your own habits. What small changes can you make that will make a difference in your life? So we're back. And I gotta say, those last couple deep dives into the power of habit have been intense. It's really made me question how much control we really have over our lives.
Yeah, those questions about habits and free will, they really get you thinking.
Remember those cases Duhigg talks about at the end? Brian Thomas, the guy who killed his wife while sleepwalking?
Yeah, and Angie Bachman, who lost everything gambling.
It's like, on the one hand, Thomas was sleepwalking. It wasn't a conscious choice, right? But then you have Bachman. She was awake, but her actions were driven by this powerful addiction.
And that's the dilemma Duhigg leaves us with. If we say Thomas isn't responsible because he was unconscious, does that mean Bachman or any addict can claim the same thing?
Yeah, where's the line? It makes you think about all the choices we make, how many are really free.
It's tough. Duhigg points to research on addiction, like with gambling. Problem gamblers' brains, they react differently to those near misses, when they almost win.
Oh, so it's like a biological thing.
It seems like it.
Yeah.
Those near misses, they trigger a dopamine rush, making them want to keep gambling even when they're losing.
So it's not just about being weak-willed. Their brains are wired differently.
It makes you wonder, if someone's predisposed to addiction, are they really in control? It's complicated, and it makes you rethink how we view addiction.
It's not just about morality, it's about understanding the science behind it. But Duhigg doesn't say we're completely powerless against our habits.
No, he says that while changing deep-rooted habits is super hard, it's not impossible. And remember the habit loop.
Cue, routine, reward.
Yep, that's the framework. But he also talks about how important belief is. People who believe they can change are more likely to actually change.
So you gotta believe in yourself, believe you can do it.
Exactly. It's about having hope and believing you can shape your own future.
He brings up Paul O'Neill again, the CEO who changed everything by focusing on worker safety. It's like a perfect example of how a small change can create bigger, positive changes.
Yeah, it was the Keystone habit, remember? It created this ripple effect throughout the company. And it all started with the belief that things could be better.
So change is possible, even on a big scale, but you need people to believe in that possibility. Which brings us right back to the power of habit. They can be good or bad. They're always there influencing us.
It's kind of like a double-edged sword.
Ah.
But if we understand how they work, we can use them to our advantage. We can create the lives we want.
That's a really empowering thought. We're not just stuck with whatever habits we have. So as we wrap up this deep dive, I'm feeling cautious, but also hopeful. Cautious because we're surrounded by these unseen forces that are shaping us, but hopeful because we can learn to understand them and take control.
I like that. It's not about being afraid of habits. It's about using them as tools to create positive change.
Absolutely. Well, this has been an incredible conversation. I'm so glad we did this deep dive into the power of habit. I feel like I've learned so much.
Me too. It's a fascinating book.
And even though we've reached the end of this deep dive, the journey doesn't stop here. We can all keep reflecting on our own habits and start making those small changes that can lead to big transformations.
Exactly. Keep learning, keep questioning, and keep growing.
That's great advice. Thanks for joining us. We'll be back soon with another deep dive into a new topic. Until then, keep exploring the power of habit in your own life.